you're not guaranteed that all of your problems are going to go away when you move to a new facility. In fact, most of the time they don't, unless the brand has really sort of looked within itself and said, hey, what were we potentially contributing to these issues?
Welcome to Blue Ocean by StartOps. Each episode, I sit down with leaders in consumer brand supply chain, finance, and CX to talk about the problems they're facing and the solutions they're using or building. I hope you enjoy the show. Hey everyone, I'm Charles Cushing, the founder of StartOps. With me here today is Jason Finkelstein, co-founder and partner at Logistics Resolve. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks, Charles. I'm really excited to be here with you today.
So so everyone has context as we go through here, what do you guys do at Logistics Resolve, and what's the main problem that you solve?
Logistics Resolve is a mediation style service where we work with brands generally focused in the D2C e-commerce space and 3PL when relationships are going off the tracks. So typically what we see is a brand is having issues, whether financial, whether it be performance or just simply relationship issues. And the 3PL is also hurting. Maybe the account is at risk, it's lower margin than expected. Those are the situations where we come in and we offer our service. We get brought on by both parties. We understand the issues, working with both sides, and then we bring them together to get things back on track and put it into a win-win position.
That's a great recap. I want to rewind back to the beginning just to learn a little bit more about you. So as I understand, you started out studying international relations and geopolitics. You even started your career in that space, if I'm not mistaken. Are you still a policy buff, or is that chapter fully behind you now that you're deep into the ops world?
I'd say I still read the news probably more than your average supply chain and operations person. A lot of what I learned in my education and early career around international negotiation and politics does actually serve me quite a bit in terms of the relationship work that I do today.
And then you went from that into consulting at Bain. After that, you became an operator, right? You spent about 3 years, is that right, as the COO of Fresh Clean Threads? How did that transition happen, and how did you jump from Bain to this next chapter?
When I was wrapping up about 4 years at Bain, I had sort of gotten that itch that a lot of consultants get to say, hey, it's been great advising and sitting next to the people who are actually making the magic happen, but I want to get into the driver's seat. And so I was looking for head of operations role at a small growing company, and I sort of stumbled into e-commerce. I wasn't specifically looking in D2C or anything like that, but I was connected through a small investor to Fresh Clean Threads, which at that point was a small D2C t-shirt company focused on subscriptions out of San Diego. Now it's sort of all history, but really, really thankful that I found e-commerce about 4 years ago, because I think that there is so much exciting going on in the industry.
What was your purview at Fresh Clean Threads? As COO, what were you in charge of, and what was some of the stuff that you oversaw in your time there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was in charge of supply chain, which broadly speaking involved planning. So demand planning, forecasting, managing our production, including quality and oversight that went in there with the vendors. Logistics, so getting goods from our manufacturers around the world to the US. Then fulfillment, which obviously is where I'm focused now. And then lastly, I oversaw a group of CX agents.
Wow. So really just kind of the end-to-end supply chain.
Most of the things that you could toss into operations. And then I had some brief spells overseeing other departments that came my way, like data and product for a time. So
yes, as every good COO will have happen.
Exactly.
Get tossed in random departments.
Exactly.
I assume the kernels of insight for what you are doing now came from that experience.
Yeah, totally. And it is based on my experience and what I saw. When I first came in, there was a challenging relationship with our fulfillment center at the time. And we ended up branching out, a bit of a distributed network and a couple of different 3PLs that we used. But what I found when I talked to, folks like yourself or other people, my peers who are operating D2C companies, is that this was a theme. It seemed like what I was hearing everywhere was, I hate my 3PL, these guys suck. Do you know any good ones that we can move to? For people that covered a lot in their purviews, it really seemed like this issue was disproportionately kind of popping up everywhere. And so that kind of got me thinking a little bit. And then as I got deeper into the e-commerce world and started talking to owners and leadership at 3PLs, what I heard was, hey, this is a really tough business. It's low margin. Customer demands are through the roof. You sort of have this relationship that develops that is really high stakes, that has all of these areas that lead to potential fissures. And so what I was seeing on both sides is, wow, this is a huge problem. And what the kind of end result of this is that brands were bouncing around all the time. And then the other thing I saw was that 3PLs were actually getting rid of their own clients, right? So often 3PLs will quote unquote fire a client when things aren't working out. Maybe they're a pain in the ass, or they're uneconomical, or the business has shifted. And when I sort of saw that, I was like, whoa, this feels like there is a lot of meat here, because these terminations and these switches are really, really costly and actually a big risk. You're not guaranteed that all of your problems are going to go away when you move to a new facility. In fact, most of the time they don't, unless the brand has really sort of looked within itself and said, hey, what were we potentially contributing to these issues? And so that's sort of where I started talking to my partner, Dan Cole, who had his whole career on the 3PL side. He owned a 3PL. He was an exec at a bunch of big ones. That's where the idea for Logistics Resolve came up.
If you could sort of make the pie chart of like, what are the most common things that lead to rifts between brands and 3PLs? What are you seeing as the common things that come up, if there is any pattern there? And also just curious about how those dynamics evolve. Like, how far into the relationship do you get before this dissatisfaction pops up? And is it usually triggered by like one big mess up? Like, we had this big holiday order, it didn't go out on time. Or is there kind of a more of a creeping dissatisfaction that edges up over time?
It's a great question. What I'll say is that caveating with every single situation is something that we've seen. We've seen it happen all different types of ways. I'd say the most common is actually the latter of what you're talking about, where it's almost like a death by 1,000 cuts. And really, I think you've got to get in the mindset of the operators in the 3PL that are kicking off the relationship, right? This is a big honeymoon. Maybe you've left another 3PL that you felt was not performing or meeting your expectations. You've gone through this RFP process. Everyone is really excited to kick off the relationship. Like with any new relationship, a lot of things might, slide. There's kind of this slow burn of maybe, hey, things aren't quite what we expected. But then to your point, you'll have a few of these critical moments or, moments of truth. Hey, this sale was really important to us and we've done a lot of prep work. We really put a lot of time into it. We're out of stock in this product. We've taken a bunch of back orders. We did pre-sales and now it's come in and it's taking a really long time to actually get inbounded and then reshipped. And so usually you have sort of this slow burn, death by 1,000 cuts with a few big moments that might start, pushing it over the top. And then to get back to the first question, in terms of what types of things we see, from the brand perspective, there's almost always some sort of financial component, right? It could be, hey, we're getting billed for things we don't think we should be getting billed for. The invoices are coming in a bit higher than we expected, or something's off plan. But it could even be so simple as visibility, right? Like we don't understand what's going on. So that's sort of one big bucket that we're seeing a lot. The second big bucket is just around, SLA performance in general. And it's not necessarily all the time. You might think, okay, we have a 99% outbound order, same day order SLA. They're coming in at 97%. It's typically not like that. It's usually sort of more isolated, higher visibility type of things. Like, we talked about big sales, or maybe it's high value customer orders are inaccurate every once in a while, but it's not usually like, hey, you're a few percentage points below SLA. It's usually there are these specific things that are needling. And then lastly, I think communication is the big thing. A lot of these problems kind of start and end with communication, or, could be resolved with communication. So it's, hey, do you not feel like the 3PL is hearing you? Do you not feel like you're getting timely responses? Do you not feel like you're getting timely resolutions? Do you not feel like the quality of the resolutions is good? So it's sort of those three big buckets, encompass most of what we see from the brand side. And then from the 3PL side, the other two that I would add on there are when the scope changes. So when the business was going to be something, maybe your Amazon business, you want to open it up and it's taking off, or hey, maybe you want to start shipping to a new retailer. Those types of things can really damage from the 3PL side. And then the last thing I'd highlight that we see a lot is just forecasting challenges, whether it's a weekly or a monthly forecast. It's just off, and both under and over can really hurt in different ways.
I've heard of 3PLs having like really strict requirements on the forecasting side on their end. And we can get back to sort of the bidirectionality of who's firing who in a minute. But in your experience, how much of this is like a matching problem where the 3PL and the client just chose each other wrong for whatever reason? The brand didn't know it was coming down the pike. The 3PL overestimated their ability versus something that's fixable. Like, your whole service is around fixing these relationships, but not every relationship is meant to be. So how do you guys think about that? And how much is the destiny set at the beginning versus, things that happen along the way?
Yeah, it's another great question. I think when you kind of put it into those two buckets, if you want to see, is this a matching problem? There's actually a pretty specific checklist that you can go through. And I won't necessarily share every single thing, but it's like if you're doing these business lines, do their other customers do these business lines, right? If you need a 3-node solution, do they have 3 nodes, right? There's sort of these kind of like X's and O's types of things that you can kind of look at pretty quickly and say, yes, they're servicing us, or no, they're not. And usually what will happen in these types of situations where it's maybe the relationship should not be saved is it was a decent choice, initially it was a decent match, but then your business has evolved, right? You have different needs, you have different things. I don't think I've seen it yet where it's like, hey, maybe you're a company that does dog toys and you're in a frozen food 3PL, right? Like you just don't really see that all that often. The other category that's what I'd call relational, or maybe even, like the solvable piece, is when some of these issues like performance, communication are really at the heart of what the issues are. And really the only times that we say, hey, this probably should end are sort of twofold. One is if for whatever reason the 3PL doesn't value your business, maybe it means you're too small, but that could kind of fall into the first bucket, right? Like you don't look like they're the customers, maybe you're too small, maybe you're complex, maybe they've had a shift in business. So it's just like, hey, they're not interested in doing business with you. So it's like at that point, hey, maybe it's good to move on. And then the other one is if there's been sort of a major kind of rift in terms of, really disrespectful things said or mistreatment, on both sides, which we have seen, but this is really towards the very, very end of the spectrum. In pretty much every situation we deal with that we do think is solvable, there's been some elevated tensions or raised voices. It's really when it kind of goes over the line that it's like, hey, maybe you shouldn't be working together anymore.
And just empirically, if you had to put a number on it based on what you've seen, salvageable versus unsalvageable, for structural reasons or otherwise, is it like 50-50, 80-20? Like if you had to ballpark it?
Let's say there's 20% of relationships that are structurally, wrong, in terms of, hey, it's just not a mismatch for the service. Let's say all of those should not be saved. Of that remaining 80%, my belief is that 80% of those could be solved. So I think in the 60 to 70% range overall of relationships that could potentially terminate, we believe those can be resolved. We're talking about termination as this big thing that is the thing to avoid. And we really do believe it should be avoided, just given that you might spend 3 or 4 months of your fulfillment budget monetarily, your fulfillment and shipping budget, your team's time actually doing the move. But there's sort of this middle ground that's maybe we don't want to terminate because we can't afford to move right now. Maybe we recognize the risk that we're not going to find a better partner, but we don't want to muddle along with kind of a mediocre relationship, performance not up to our standards, maybe a bit of an elevated cost profile. And so there's that big world of, I think, relationships where it's not necessarily terminate or stay, but it's maybe we have performance we're not happy with. How can we get that to being something that each party feels really good about?
And I think that's a perfect segue into just talking about, like, what are the steps that you take to try to remediate whatever wrongs are being felt on both sides?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of our solution is based on commercial mediation. Dan and I both have actually gotten certifications in commercial mediation to go along with our industry experience that we have. And so some of the principles are based there, but what we'll do is we'll start off with pretty deep discovery. And so we'll get each side separately and we'll have a series of Zoom calls where we'll start to understand, hey, what are your issues? What's going wrong? What do you need out of the relationship? Give us that entire laundry list of things that if you could snap your finger would change. So once we've done those discovery sessions, we'll have a pretty meaty list of all the things that each side wants to get addressed. And we'll bring the two sides together. This is usually on site or in a neutral office facility where we'll then have our agenda of all of the things we need to talk through. And really, we'll be facilitating the negotiation and the solutioning of each issue. And it's not necessarily going to be like, hey, we've solved, 5 issues and we have 3 that we can't get to. What we're trying to do is get to something that is very holistic and kind of integrative, where each side is going to, give a little bit. Each side is going to get a little bit. We want to solve the whole issue versus kind of picking off a few different things that are low-hanging fruit and easy to agree on. And so that whole process, at the end of that day, we'll have a document or a list of commitments of, hey, this is what each side has agreed to. And we try to get that whole piece of it done within 30 days. So we want to get to basically path forward resolution within 30 days really quickly. And then after that, depending on what the parties want, which but generally recommend that we'll stick around, right? And on a monthly, bi-weekly, whatever basis might make sense for that particular engagement, we'll actually monitor, hey, is each side tracking towards the commitments that they made, the milestones that they made. If there are new issues that come up, we'll be there to help come up with a good resolution for those. We want to stick around to provide both that accountability and then the support for each party to hit what they had committed to in the session.
It might be too early to say, what are the leading indicators that this approach has been working, or how do you feel like it's been going so far?
Well, so far we haven't seen any terminations after one of these sessions. So that's a pretty good leading indicator, at least from the past few months. But really what I'd say to that is that what we see is a pretty serious 180 in the tone and tenor of the relationship. So before we come in, you get a lot of what I said at the beginning, right? I hate my 3PL. These guys suck. They're screwing us. I don't like the way they speak to us. But then once you get into the session, you sort of hear this commitment of, hey, we acknowledge that things haven't gone as well as either side wanted them to in the beginning, but we're both sitting here and committing that we're going to try to make it work moving forward. And so sort of that commitment and that turn goes a long way towards saying, hey, we're actually partners working through this versus adversaries sitting across the table from each other.
And I guess just on a technical note, who usually initiates this process and who pays for it? When someone discovers you, is it the 3PL going to the brand? Is the brand going to the 3PL? How do you convince both sides that this is a worthwhile process to go through? And then who foots the bill at the end of the day?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've had engagements come from both sides so far, and that's sort of how we think it should be. Really either side could raise their hand at any time and say, hey, this is not going the way we want it to. We want to bring in a third party to help fix it. Our recommendation is that both sides split the bill. And it's less so because they might need financial support compared to the overall invoice, compared to the overall margin in the account. Our fee should really be kind of like a footnote, but it's more, we want to demonstrate that both sides have kind of skin in the game and an investment to it. And so what I will say is that for the engagements that the brands have brought, we've usually been pretty successful in having each party split the fee. When the 3PL brings the engagement, so far it's been a little bit harder to have the brand foot the bill because, they're saying, hey, we already feel like, messing up on X, Y, and Z. We might already feel like we're paying too much.
Yeah, that makes sense. There is still one party is paying the other at the end of the day. So, it's obviously costly in different ways for brands, but it's a little less transparent. We talked about, matchmaking. There are tons of 3PL marketplaces and brokers out there who will offer to try to find you the perfect 3PL to match with. As far as I know, you're the only group I've come across so far that's trying to fix these relationships once you get into the nitty-gritty of reality and expectations being missed. Why do you think that is? Why aren't there more 3PL marriage counselors out there?
Yeah, Charles, it's a really interesting question. It's something that I've thought about a bit because I agree, while mediation is out there in all kinds of industries, whether it's insurance, construction, even community disputes. This isn't something that we've seen in logistics, or at least that we've come across. I think there's probably a few reasons. First off, it's quite lucrative to be a 3PL marketplace or a broker. Typically they're able to get a percentage of the lifetime revenue on that contract, and that revenue can be priced in to the price that the customer is seeing. So it's almost like you're selling a bit of a free service to the 3PLs there, and it's getting passed through kind of on the back end to the customer. So I think that's, a little bit from the broker side, right? Why would you want to do that versus this? I think from the customer side, I think there's a push when you're an operational leader of, hey, I want to come in and make a change. I want to get, step change improvement. And oftentimes the 3PL is the first thing that you want to look at. And so it sort of looks a lot better. And honestly, I've been in that seat. It feels a lot better to go into your leadership meeting, your exec meeting, and say, hey, we're conducting an RFP. We have these great options. We're going to save, 20% here, and we're going to have all these issues addressed versus, yeah, my team kind of got down to brass tacks. We've fixed a couple little things here. It's getting a bit better. Yeah, we're improving week by week or month by month. That's why there's sort of this shiny object of let's do the RFP, let's move on versus, hey, let's see what we can salvage here. It might not be as exciting, but maybe that's actually the right thing for the business.
It's really cool. I'm glad that you guys are bringing this to the industry. Let's say Logistics Resolve didn't exist. What are some things that you would advise any brand, or frankly, even any 3PL, to keep that relationship healthy from the get-go? I'm sure at this point you've seen every kind of different way of mediating communications between 3PLs and brands. Are there any patterns you've seen, any best practices that you feel like you could establish?
Yeah, absolutely. And whenever we have an engagement where the parties come to us and say, hey, actually, we don't need to hire Logistics Resolve. We were able to come to an agreement internally between ourselves. Yeah, we say, great. That's awesome. That's how it should work. I'm really happy that was able to happen. But There's a few things that I'd recommend brands, and I think they go just as much to the 3PL side as well. I would say would be really start off the process by looking at yourself. Like in any relationship, you want to say, hey, what am I actually doing to potentially cause these issues? Folks would come to me and say, hey, we have this vendor not performing. We have these issues. Say, great, let's brainstorm. What are the things we're doing that are making their life hard that could potentially have contributed to these misses? You could almost say, hey, we need to take away their excuses for any type of behavior. So then when we go to them and say, hey, we have these issues, we've done everything we can to fix them. So that's sort of the first thing. And obviously that can happen from the 3PL side as well. The second piece would just be really open communication. And I'm talking less about kind of the day-to-day tactical communication, but having these kind of real talks or big talks and not shying away from the difficult conversations. So asking those questions and saying, hey, is our account meeting your margin and revenue expectations? Are there things that my team is doing that's making your life difficult? What are the things that we could be doing better as a brand to fit into your operation? And really kind of taking that customer vendor lens off and thinking about it as a partnership, but really getting down to those conversations that it's a lot easier to just kind of gloss over, but they will come. They'll just come later in a much more difficult setting. And then there's obviously the tactical things that I think a lot of operators, know about of, hey, pay a lot of attention to your forecasting. Anytime there's going to be a business profile change, make sure you really get in front of that and really detail, what that might mean. But I think those are things that are on a lot of operators' radar. The first two things I think are really the ones that I see differentiate folks.
What's the right cadence for these big soul-searching conversations? I mean, I think a lot of businesses just as a default have like quarterly business review set up. And I guess that often is probably like a little bit, well, the 3PL is going to come and present how great they are. But like, is it part of that process or is this like a separate conversation? And how often should that be happening?
In my opinion, and this might be a bit contrarian, the QBR, the ABR, whatever it might be, is not the right place for those conversations. And it's generally because of who's in the room. These are sort of deeper one-on-one conversations where you really need to have them with your counterpart or, leadership to leadership. And they're usually best done one-on-one. If you have a lot of folks in the room that may actually be part of the problem, that may actually be the folks that need to get feedback to do things differently, they typically won't go as well. So better, one-to-one, always better in person, but if not, Zoom is totally fine. In terms of the cadence, I think it really varies depending on the relationship. If the relationship is new or if things are going off track in directions you don't want, even up to once a month, these are the right time. I wouldn't do it less than a couple times a year. Typically around quarterly, I think is probably the right cadence to really, really have those in-depth conversations.
And I'm sure once you have the first one, all the subsequent ones get easier because you just get used to talking in that language. And one other question related to that, does technology play a role at all here? Is there a substantial role that tech plays here, or is that a little bit more of an afterthought?
It's a good question. And I think that the answer is that it can be. It can be part of the problem and it can be part of the solution. It just sort of depends, like what are the issues that a brand is having. If it's a visibility issue where it's, hey, we don't have insight into our operation, we don't know our inventory, we don't actually know if you're hitting SLA because we haven't gotten a good calculation for it. Certainly technology can be part of a solution. Some of the value that we bring as Logistics Resolve is we'll actually help do some of that analysis. We'll put together, if there are misses, we'll say, hey, what are the actual facts on the ground and try to get something that can actually be compared over time. But I think it really depends. Sometimes issues are technology based of saying, hey, this integration doesn't exist. We want you to integrate with a carrier. It'll take a long time for the IT team to build out. Sometimes those issues come up. And obviously, if it's a tech issue, then should be a tech solution. Sometimes there are some workarounds. But I think to answer the question, it really depends on what the profile of the issues are.
For anyone who's thinking about using Logistics Resolve or a service like Logistics Resolve, what are the major hesitations that you hear coming from people? And what have you found to be the most effective at getting people to conviction one way or the other?
Yeah, totally. I think given that this type of mediation service is really a first in logistics and in this industry, something that we hear a lot, both from 3PLs and from operations leaders at brands is like, hey, isn't this kind of my job to overcome these issues? It's a really valid concern, right? It makes sense. And what we usually say to that is that just like any other area of your job, Logistics Resolve is just a tool. So for certain situations, maybe it makes sense to use consultants or different specialists. And so sometimes with 3PL or your customer relationship, it makes sense to use Logistics Resolve. What we find is that we have a pretty high success rate in situations where there's not a lot of headway to be had, right? So sides have kind of settled into their talking points. You're sort of saying the same thing, you're getting the same thing back. Nobody's really hearing each other. There might be a lack of trust or perceived bias on either side where it's like, hey, I'm saying my piece and it makes night and day complete sense to me, but for some reason, they're just not understanding it. And then a lot of times there's elevated emotions too. And that's really where a third party can help break the ice, provide a bit of an objective view, sort of lower that temperature in the room and help you achieve whatever objectives you might have.
Are you always brought in as this last resort? Do you offer any kind of service around just like good 3PL relationship hygiene where it's like, like we're not at the breaking point yet, but like, let's just make sure we're using all the best practices that we can have in the arsenal?
So far, most of our engagements have sort of been last resort, although we would love to come in earlier. I think what happens is that everybody has a natural tendency to, hey, like, let's fix this. Like, let's make it better. And you'll, sort of work. And you might not realize or understand like, hey, we've been doing the same thing for a while and it's just not working. A lot of times if we came in where there's just sort of this general sense of dissatisfaction, but it's not, really off the rails quite yet, I think we could be really effective, sort of have shorter engagements, have really quick resolutions, and really facilitate that partnership a lot quicker sometimes versus undoing a lot of the trauma that's been seen when you get to kind of like the breaking point.
It's an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Great. Well, we're coming up on time here. So I just wanted to say thank you, Jason, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Charles, for having me. It was really a good time.
And for those of you listening, we're going to link to Logistics Resolve and their verified page in the StartOps directory in the show notes. If you have any questions, looking forward to hearing them, and thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Blue Ocean. Blue Ocean is produced by StartOps, a growing collection of resources for operations leaders at e-commerce brands. A few of the things we built include a growing, vendor-free Slack community for operators to ask their most important questions and get answers from trusted peers, a job board that curates jobs from 1,500 modern brands, a media hub that includes this podcast, as well as articles and templates on a variety of operations topics, and a comprehensive directory of the software and services used by our community members. If you want to learn more, head to startops.network. And to keep up with the latest information from StartOps, or catch the most recent episodes of Blue Ocean, follow the StartOps page on LinkedIn or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks for listening and hope to catch you next episode.